On the subject of the multiple choice, as I'm sure you've all noticed, in every test I'll usually include like 1 or 2 joke answers, just to make it easier, like then you have to choose out of 3. This is a gift, this is generosity. But many of you did not accept the gift for this last test. So for tolerance in drug use, I think I asked something like what is tolerance in the context of drug use? And one of the answers was tolerance being like you get used to a drug and you need more of the drug to get the same high. And one of the answers was, when I take drugs, bro, I just become so accepting of others, you know? Yeah, man. 7% of you chose that. Maybe you were trolling, I don't know, maybe you were really confident. If so, I mean, it worked. I was very amused, but anyways. All right. Another piece of housekeeping that I'll mention, I have added some terms to chapters 8 and 11. So if you want to quickly download the latest version, that's fine. Or you can just download it later tonight or whatever. But there's a few more terms for both chapter 8 and chapter 11. And the final is coming up. There's only 2 weeks left of new content, this week and next week. And then, all right, settle down, end your conversations. So this week we're doing memory, next week we're doing motivation and emotion. The week after that is test review, and then the final. The final is, again, here during normal class time. It will be 70 multiple choice questions. 30 of them will be on chapters 1 through 7. 40 of them will be on chapters 8 and 11. I had told some of you during office hours, like some of you had asked me about this, about whether the cumulative part would be more broad, and I've already written that part, and it's basically going to be the same, actually. Now that I've actually written it out, it'll be roughly the same level of difficulty and specificity as the tests that you received earlier. So a little warning on that. Okay, let's get started on memory. So much of the memory section, in fact most of it, is based on the cognitive perspective. I once took an entire course on cognitive psychology, and around half of it was on memory. Memory is something that cognitive people have done a lot of work on. And because of this, much of the language used in this chapter relies on the computer metaphor. Right off the bat, the first bolded term is encoding, and the next one is storage. These are terms that are deliberately chosen by the cognitive people to emphasize the extent to which their models relate to the computer analogy, right? The idea that the brain is an information processor. Now this is just an analogy and a model. The brain isn't literally a computer. I mean, there are some interesting similarities. One that I may have mentioned is that computers work in binary code, right? Either 1 or 0, right? Either current goes through a whatever or doesn't, right? On or off. And the brain is like that, right? Neurons either fire or do not fire, and that's the means by which information is processed. But there are, of course, differences, so this is just a metaphor. But it has proven to be a very useful metaphor. This has guided a lot of the research into memory, and it's proven very theoretically fruitful. It, of course, used to be the psychoanalysts who did a lot of work into memory. Not so much anymore. And just in case these terms are opaque to you, the term encoding means transferring information into memory, right? Getting it into storage. And storage is where it is stored, right? So how the information is kept available for use later. And then retrieval is accessing the stored information. And probably the most influential model of the different aspects of memory is the what I jokingly call the two Richards model. It was developed by Richard Atkinson and Richard Schifrin. And it's the 3-component model. Incidentally, I was friends with a guy named Richard in high school, and he actually had an award in our school named after him, the King Richard Award. I was an acting kid in high school, did a lot of theater before I decided to be a serious person. And Richard was very active in the acting scene, and one of his roles was to be the king in Cinderella. I was in Cinderella too, don't judge me. I had a good time. Richard was the king, and the running joke in the play was that he was fat. He's actually not, but that's part of the script. And one time, on stage, he sat down on his throne, and the thrones were just pieces of shit. Our department didn't have a lot of money. Broke right under in front of the whole audience, straight to his butt, completely collapsed. And he totally played it off. He's like, oh, I've gained more weight, pretending he was part of the scene. Everyone bought it, so he deserves the award. That has nothing to do with anything, it's the two Richards model. Makes me think of him. Okay, so as you can see, this model has three components to memory: sensory memory, short-term, and long-term. These words have, of course, made their way into the public imagination, although they mean something slightly different than what. There's some terms that the public kind of ruins. Like, one is schizophrenia. Most people think schizophrenia means split personality, which is kind of what the jokes in the movies say. It, of course, is not that. It's related to things like hallucinations and delusions, but there's some similar misunderstandings here. So the first component is sensory memory. Sensory memory is generally, it depends on which sense we're talking about, but it's less than 1 second to 5 seconds is how long this one lasts, so very short. And there are different subtypes. What this basically is your memory of what you just immediately experienced. So if someone was to ask you, what did you just see, or what did you just hear? Sensory memory is what captures that. And it can handle quite a bit of information, but most of it is lost very quickly, especially in the case of vision, which I'll say more about in a second. So as I say, this breaks down into two subcomponents, the iconic store and the echoic store. So I-C-O-N-I-C, iconic, and E-C-H-O-I-C, echoic. As you might be able to guess, iconic is visual, echoic is auditory, like hearing, right, like echo. So we'll start with iconic. Iconic is the one that lasts less than a second, very brief. So if I was to walk into this room, quickly look and close my eyes, and someone was to ask me, like, what's going on over there, I may be able to say something about it, but only if you ask me immediately. One of the experiments they've done, the book talks about, is they will flash to people on the screen like a dozen numbers. So, something like this. So just like a dozen letters. Just flash it for like a 20th of a second. Immediately after, they will give one of three sounds: a high-pitched noise, a medium noise, or a low noise, and you are told that you have to say the letters on top if you hear the high noise. Say the letters. Did I say numbers? Letters if you hear the high-pitched noise. Say the middle letters if you hear the medium noise, and the bottom letters if you hear the deep noise. And people can do this easily, right? You flash it, ding, high noise, and then they say S, F, G, L very easily, and same for the middle and the bottom. But if you flash it and then say, please say all of them, by the time they say more than 4 or 5, they've forgotten the others. That's how quick it is, right? So any longer than S, G, L, I don't remember. But they can still remember any line you choose. So for that less than a second, all 12 are there, but most of them fade away very quickly. Echoic memory, or the echoic store, is somewhat longer. I've heard different estimates. The book says, I think 3 to 4. I've heard 5, but just a few seconds. It's a bit longer than iconic. sensory memory. So what this means is, even if you're not paying attention to what someone is saying at all, you can remember what they said for the previous 5 seconds. One important thing that we're going to talk more about in a second, in order for something to move from sensory memory to short-term memory, which is more like 15 to 30 seconds, as I'll be saying, the thing that determines what goes from that memory, this memory to this memory, is attention, what you pay attention to. So if you're paying attention to what someone is saying, you can remember further back. You can, because you're thinking about it, you're processing it. But if you're not paying attention to it, it just stays in sensory memory. Here's a little practical implication of this. I'm sure many of you have had the experience of talking to someone you know, and they're on their phone or their head's in space, and you can tell they're not paying attention. And if you're passive aggressive, you might say like, hey, what did I just say? To test them. And here's the thing to know. Even if they are not paying attention to you at all, they will be able to remember the last 4 or 5 seconds. So if you want to be extra passive aggressive, you ask what you said 10 seconds ago. That's the real test. So I'm helping you all be better at being passive aggressive. There you go. There's a little technique to know. So as I say, though, attention is what determines what goes from sensory to short-term. So we'll move on to short-term memory. Short-term memory is also sometimes called working memory. This is the stuff that you are kind of consciously working through and thinking about. And it goes back around 15 to 30 seconds, typically speaking. However, if you're focusing on a small amount of information, it can potentially go for as long as you're awake. So if I was to sit in a room and just say some numbers to myself, like continuously, and just hold them, that would technically be short-term memory, but I could keep that going as long as I'm awake. Doesn't necessarily mean it's getting transferred to long-term. We'll talk later about what gets stuff into long-term, but in the absence of deliberate concentration on a small amount of information, this tends to last 15 to 30 seconds. The reason it's sometimes called working memory is that it's what you can use it to, oh yes?
I was curious, some musicians can just hear music and it can go for like 3 minutes and they can play it flawlessly. Would that be considered short-term memory?
I'm not sure what you mean. So you mean they can hear like one piece of a song and then play the rest?
No, like they hear an entire piece, right?
Oh, okay, yeah.
Play it back.
Oh, yeah, we'll talk about that later. What that would be is expert knowledge. So it's easier to remember lots of stuff if you already have a pre-existent kind of schema for it, or a concept of it. So one example I'm going to use later, but it partly answers your question. A chess grandmaster can look at a very complicated chess scene and easily remember every bit of it. But that's because they have a concept for it already. So I'll be saying more about that later, but yeah, it's a good question. I forgot what yes, so the reason it's called working memory is it's the kind of memory you need to work through problems. So if I was to give you a math problem, like a mediumly hard one, I don't know, like 37 times 12, you could probably do it, but you have to like remember different steps that you finished. So you have to go, 2 times this, carry it, and like you have to kind of hold in your memory what you did at the beginning and then keep going through it. That's using your short-term or working memory. One quick and easy way of measuring people's short-term memory capacity is the digit span. Digit span. And if you want to test yourself out, there's lots of tests online. You can do it in the book. It's just how many numbers can you say back? So in the book, it's like 8352. So if someone's giving this test to you, they'll read the numbers to you, and you go, oh, 8352. And then you keep making the number longer, so 43931. And then repeat it back. And you keep making it longer until they start messing up. And the longest you can go without messing up, that's your digit span. Most people have a digit span of around 7. There's a famous paper in cognitive psychology called the magic number of 7 plus or minus 2, which means that most people are between 5 and 9. And this is true for other kinds of information too. The amount of information that we can hold in short-term memory is usually 7 units. Interestingly enough, a lot of components of the IQ tests, different versions of the IQ test, are basically tests of working memory. Working memory is very closely related to what IQ tests measure. And actually many IQ tests just have the digit span as an example. And this is a little aside, you won't really need to worry about this till 105, but in IQ they're really interested in something called G. Have any of you heard of G? General intelligence? None, okay. You'll hear about it a lot in 105. This is basically the statistical component of IQ tests that all the subtests tap into. Because different components of the IQ test are all strongly correlated with each other. And different types of IQ tests are more strongly correlated with G, meaning they are better at predicting how well you will do on all of the other tests. So for example, the digit span, just how many numbers can you say back, is not very strongly correlated with the other tests. It has a pretty low G loading. But what's interesting is if you have the reverse digit span test, which is how many numbers can you say backwards. So if I was to say, 8, 3, 5, 2, you have to go 2, 5. You have to say it backwards. That's harder to do, and that's a better predictor of how well you'll do on all the other components of the IQ test. Anyways, that you will not be tested on. That's just a little bit of an aside. Okay, so I said that it's easy to hold about 7 units of information in your memory at a time, but we're going to do a little activity related to this. And I need 2 volunteers. And for this one, I'm going to say it's going to stay in, so only volunteer if you're comfortable being in the video. Any volunteers? I have 1. Okay, you can come up. Okay, 1. Okay, you can come up. Okay, so you raised your hand first. Okay, can you step outside? Someone will get you after. You're not in trouble, but in order for it to work, you have to step outside. Maybe plug your ears while you're out there too. I don't know how loud I am. Exactly, perfect. What a good participant. Okay, so for you, you can just stand there. What I'm going to do is I'm going to say 9 words. And I want you at the end to say as many, and if you pass, I'd be amazed. It'd actually ruin the exam, but do your best. Try and get as many as you can. So I'm going to read 9 words. Pen, beef, Obama, pencil, pork, Trump, eraser, chicken, Biden. Okay, as many as you can.
Pen, beef, Obama, pencil, pork, Trump, Biden, Trump.
There it is. This happens. Better than average. Okay, can someone get the person out there? Wait, is he not? Oh, okay. Okay, so I'm going to say 9 words to you, and I want you to say back as many as you can. Pen, pencil, eraser, beef, pork, chicken, Obama, Trump, Biden.
Pen, pencil, eraser, beef, pork, chicken, and Obama, Trump, Biden.
Good. All right, you can both take a seat. Okay, so this is a little so obviously you didn't see what happened. So the first person, I made him say the exact same 9 words, but in a random order. and he was able to get 7 after some effort, which is actually better than most do. And you got 9 very easily. But this is not because person 2 is smarter, it's because obviously the words were organized into 3 clear categories. All right? So this relates to a term, chunking. Pretty intuitive word. You've probably all already figured out what it means. So we can hold 7 units of information in our head, but if you group things together into meaningful units, this expands how much you can remember. Okay, another kind of silly example in the book is there's a list of, I forget how many, 17 random letters, like B, I, R, C, a total mess. If I was to give that to you all, you would all fail at remembering it. But if I put it into a sentence, it was a squeaky crib, very easy to remember. Because now it's not 17 units of information, it's 5, right? 5 words, and therefore much easier to deal with. I don't know the details of this, but I was in a class where a professor described a study in which they took someone with a digit span of 7, meaning totally average, and through practice at chunking, practice at kind of grouping numbers into meaningful units, he was able to get it up to, I think, like 70 or something, like extremely high, just because he practiced grouping them together into meaningful units. Okay. 2 other terms, and this is getting a bit crowded, so I think I'm just going to erase this stuff. Any questions? Sorry, I always think to ask after I partly erase, but any questions on the basic? We're going to talk about long-term memory later, but on the basic idea of the model, any questions? Okay. It's funny, one time I did that little activity with chunking, and the first person did better, and I thought, well, class is never going to believe anything I say. I think it was with a smaller, like AP Psych kind of class. But luckily this one worked out, so. Okay, but the next 2 terms are maintenance rehearsal and elaborative rehearsal. Rehearsal here means kind of going over something in your head so as to try to remember it. And there are 2 kinds, maintenance and elaborative. Maintenance means essentially repetition, just kind of repeating the information to yourself over and over again, trying really hard to get it in there. Whereas elaborative rehearsal comes from the word elaborate, so elaborating on the information, making connections between that information and other things you know, and therefore trying to have a kind of deeper understanding of it. And this is one of my first memory tips, right? Back on the first day of class. Maintenance rehearsal is not very good at moving things from short-term to long-term. Elaborative is much better. This is why I said on the first day of class, if you want to remember something, don't try to memorize it, try to understand it. Try to make connections between that concept and other things that you know. Just repeating it to yourself is not very effective. Okay, so as sensory memory breaks down into 2 parts, short-term memory does as well. So the main, now I'm not probably going to test you on the details of these. This is a bit more advanced. The book only discusses them briefly, but this will come up if you take like a cognitive psychology class. The main one I remember is the term central executive. Central executive. How many of you have heard the phrase executive functioning? A few of you. So this is something they test in kids sometimes. It's essentially how good your working memory is, or how good you are kind of concentrating on information and working through it. And in the standard way of modeling this, the central executive is kind of in the frontal lobes, So it's kind of concentrating on something and working through it. And these three subcomponents are the main three things that feed into working memory. Visual spatial sketchpad is your ability to process visual information, right? So kind of to work through what that means. Yes?
I just had a question about maintenance rehearsal and elaborate
Yeah.
rehearsal. For maintenance rehearsal, it says like in the notes and everything that it's like not accurate in like long-term memory. Would that still be a thing when like, let's say you're trying to memorize a song and you like listen to the song over and over and over again, then like in the long term you don't forget the words to that song, or like let's say you're memorizing lines for like a play, you don't really forget those lines. So is it more like schoolwork or other things that maintenance rehearsal?
Oh, so in general, even for a song or for things, it's not that maintenance is useless. Look, if you repeat things over and over again, it increases the likelihood of you memorizing it. All I'm saying is that elaborative is better. If you understand it more deeply, you're more likely to remember it. But anyways, yeah, so visual spatial sketchpad is your ability to work through what visual information means. This is going to be occipital and parietal largely, and more so the right hemisphere. The phonological loop is auditory information, working through that, working through language, working through what you hear. And episodic buffer is tapping into long-term memory, actually, your memory of prior things that have happened to you, and bringing that to bear on your kind of working through, on how you work through something. So I won't test you on the details of the three pieces underneath. That's just to prime you for future cognitive courses. Okay, so we'll now move on to long-term memory. And we'll do another activity for this. This one will involve all of you. So I am going to read, and no writing down. I'm going to read out, I think I have 15 here, or no, 18. 18 words. I'm going to read them all out loud, and I want you all to remember as many as you can. So at the end, you will write down as many as you can. Pretty simple. So I will get started. I mean, it'll be hard, but the idea is pretty simple. Okay. Plane, nation, cat, stretch, attack, lettuce, playground, suit, pig, request, appliance, vest, baby, volcano, crack, north, society, look. Go. It was 18. I'll give you another like 10 seconds. The point will still be clear even if you don't get out every one that you can actually. No. Okay, stop there. So, question. How many of you have look? Show of hands. So that one was the last one, obviously. How many of you have plane? Right? How many of you have request? How many of you have pig? Those are two in the middle. Pig is a bit more. So it's hard for me to tell visually, but it certainly looked to me like the first one and the last one had many more, and that's what you find in the studies. This is the serial position effect or serial position curve. There's a nice picture of it in the book, which I can erase. So let's say this is percentage remembered. And this is the order. So first word, last word. If you test right away, right after the information has been given, you find this. Words at the beginning and the end are remembered the best. Words in the middle are remembered the worst. All else being equal. If you test longer after, you get something more like this. So you don't get, some related terms. So the term for this overall effect is the serial position curve, two different versions. The term for this, the beginning part, is the primacy effect, which just means you tend to remember things at the beginning better. And the term for this, which only works if you test right away, is the recency effect. Things that are at the end you remember better. Okay. So next, now lots of activities today. We have to talk about different levels of processing. And before I explain that in more detail, we're going to do another quick activity. So here's the way this will work. I'm going to give a series of word pairs, 9, and there's going to be 3 parts of this. For the first part, I'm going to write out 9 word pairs one at a time. I want you all to raise your hand if the words match for capitalization. This is actually based on an experiment the book describes. So if both are uppercase, both words are all uppercase, that's a match. If they're both all lowercase, that's a match. If one's uppercase, one's lowercase, don't raise your hand. That's a fail. No match. Okay. First one. Do they match? Show of hands. Good. I thought maybe there'd be one, you know. Some people did give that tolerance answer, so. Show of hands. Good. Some of you didn't raise your hands. Okay. Show of hands. Do they match? Good. Okay, so that's part 1. Part 2, I'm going to do 3 more word pairs, and this time I want you to raise your hand if they rhyme, if they make a noise that rhymes. Okay, show of hands. Do they rhyme? Good. Back to elementary school. But there is a point to this, I promise. Show of hands. Show of hands. Okay. Final part, 3 pairs of words, and this time I want you to raise your hand if they mean the same thing, if they are synonyms. Okay, show of hands. Good. Okay, show of hands. last word pair. Show of hands. Good, okay. Now, I'm going to read the first 9, like for each one I'm going to read the first word and write down the second word if you remember it. Okay, apple. No, write it down. Table. Fallen. House. Tall. Serve. Smart. Building. And car. Okay, now I'll give the right answers. You can mark them, and then we'll do something with that. So for apple, it was stole. So number 1 is stole, so I wouldn't spoil that. What? Okay, I'm messy, right. If you wrote store or stole, whatever. Next was more. 3 was larger. 4 was mouse. 5 was fall. 6 was bath. 7 intelligent. 8 room. And 9 automobile. Okay. So now these fall into 3 groups. Now look at which one did you do the best on? First one, second one, or the third one? Now someone may have ruined this by saying something out loud, but how many of you did best on the first one? How many of you did best on the last one? Yes. Now this is not the primacy or the recency effect. When they do this, they randomize the order. People remember it best when they're forced to process the meaning. So these are 3 different levels of processing. This is an example of what the book calls levels of processing theory. And the basic idea is the more deeply you process something, the more likely you are to remember it. This connects again to why it's good to try to understand something and think about the meaning. So if you think about the shape of the letters, that's very superficial. Is it capital or not? You're not really thinking about it all that deeply. Thinking about the sound is a bit more deep, and thinking about the meaning is the deepest, according to this model. The book also mentions that using visual imagery is effective, and actually that's going to come up later in the chapter as well. But we already saw that in chapter 2, where we did that within subjects experiment. Oh, yes?
Can you explain again how it isn't recency effect?
It isn't the recency effect because when they do this study and randomize the order, you get the same effect. I could have done the meaning at the beginning and it would have been the same, based on the other studies. Now, based on how I did it here, obviously it's a confounding variable. I couldn't conclude based on this study that the meaning matters, but people who do this study more carefully, I don't want to kick out 2/3 of you and bring to that's a pain. So I just did it like that. But yeah, good question. So yeah, visualization actually we'll come back to in a bit. So there are various ways of improving your memory, and these are called, the term for these is mnemonics. So we've already seen some of them. Right? A mnemonic is just a memory aid, or a memory technique, a method for increasing your memory. Mnemonic. So it's M and N, but the N is silent. Whoever made up the word is goofy. And one mnemonic that the book talks about is the method of loci, L-O-C-I. This is using visualization to guide your memory, especially kind of a visual scene. So this is a method used by the ancient Greeks. They would memorize like a landscape visually and place different things in the visual landscape to associate with maybe lines in a speech. So you want to memorize a speech, you kind of picture like, I don't know, like a field, you walk through the field, you visualize one thing here, another thing here, and then you visualize yourself walking through the field, and each element is a reminder for a different part of the speech. Very effective. And I have a bit of a longer video clip, but it's towards the end of the semester. You can have some fun. It's a clip from Sherlock. Oh, I forgot to show that. Oh, what the heck, it's a fun. So one video I forgot to show that illustrates sensory memory is this one. So actually, I'll just show it. So I'll start with this. This is going back a bit, but kind of a good illustration of a concept we talked about earlier. So I'll show this video about sensory memory, and then we'll move on to the more fun clip. Okay, so apologies for the being out of order, but this goes back to that three-component model with sensory memory going into short-term memory memory being what you're conscious of and thinking of. None of you are colorblind. You all saw that it was purple, right? If I'd asked you, hey, what color is it, like right after, you'd go, oh, it's purple. But because you aren't paying attention to it, you're not focusing your attention on it, it just disappears. You just kind of lose track of it. Because only what you pay attention to goes into short-term memory. So most of it just disappeared. So that's an illustration of that principle. The term for that, by the way, which I don't think is in the books, and I don't think it's one of the key terms, but is change blindness. Change blindness is one way of demonstrating how brief sensory memory is. If you want to be very amused, you can Google videos of this. There's kind of field experiments where there'll be a cashier like helping someone. They'll pop their head down for like 2 seconds, pop up and it's a different person. Most people don't notice. As long as gender doesn't change, people just don't really notice. So that's that. Okay, so back to our order, we were dealing with the method of loci. And as I say, I have kind of a fun break. We're going to watch a bit of Sherlock. How many of you have seen Sherlock? The rest of you, there's a Sherlock-shaped hole in your soul. Spoiler alert, so if you're planning on watching one of the episodes, I guess you could step out if you wanted to. So the only context you need is that, so there's Sherlock, obviously, there's John Watson. Watson's wife, it turns out, is an assassin, used to be, but Sherlock and John want to keep this under wraps. So we'll watch like the important like 10, 15 minutes or so, because it does connect to the usefulness of visualizing things. Okay. All right. Okay. So, friend, who says psychology is useless? If you're looking to be a supervillain, there's at least one, possible application. So that's a long illustration of the method of loci, using visual landscapes to remember information. Okay. The next section relates to what this gentleman asked earlier, and that is using schemas to help you remember things. Schemas are thought to be the basis of why it's easier for experts to remember complex things within their area of expertise. So a schema is a concept or a set of expectations that you have in your head, kind of a mental framework that you can put things into. Makes it easy to organize and interpret incoming information, even complex information. So one example that I mentioned earlier was chess. So I know how to play chess, but I don't know any fancy strategy. So, if I was to look at this for a second and then look away and try to remember where all the pieces were, I would not be able to do it, right? I know what the pieces are, but a chess grandmaster might be able to look at this and goes, oh, it's Smith's Gambit or something. They have all these names for fancy strategies. I know nothing about that kind of thing, but a chess grandmaster could easily look at this and reproduce it later. An example that's closer to home, if I was to look at this for like a second, I mean, I've already seen it, I made this PowerPoint, but if I was to look at this for the first time and then look away, I can easily remember where everyone's limbs were. Many of you are probably struggling to figure out where they are anyways, and remembering it would be very difficult if you only saw it for 1 second. I know one person in the class is a judo black belt. Oh yeah, Tyson, there you are. Maybe I shouldn't have done that, but well, at least it was something good. But can anyone tell me what this is, Tyson or someone else? What move is this? Anyone in jiu-jitsu or judo? No? Okay. Well, for whatever it's worth, it's the Kimura. This is the Kimura from closed guard. Not quite closed guard. The Kimura from guard, though. It's my favorite submission. So what the guy on the bottom is doing is he's going to bend that guy's arm back up towards his head until he taps out, which he will. Very effective submission. The arm will either break or you give up. Those are the two options with the Kimura. But this is another example, and I'm not an expert in BJJ, but I know enough to look at this and easily put it into a schema. So there's another example. Another obvious example is language, right? When you have words, it's easy to put lots of letters into information. Like I used that example earlier. We all know how to use English, and therefore can store away more information easily than if it was just a string of random letters. Okay, any questions about mnemonics or schemas or anything we've covered? Okay. So, how are memories stored? And there are two different physical theories that you should know. These are both models of how the brain stores information. They're both network theories, but they are slightly different. The first one, which is this one, is associative networks. And so there's a nice visualization here that I took from the textbook. So say the word you're thinking about is fire engine. It is very closely associated with truck, red, and fire, obviously. Meaning that if you think about a fire truck, those other concepts are very closely positioned in the associative network, and therefore they are primed. And there's some evidence that was consistent with this model. You give people a what's called I think it's called a lexical decision task, but I'll just call it a word decision task, where you're given a set of letters, and you have to say word or non-word. So you have like 2 buttons, you have to push one if it's a word and one if it's just random letters. So word or not a word. And the question is, how quickly do you click word correctly? And if you just got a word that is associated with the other word, you'll click it quicker. So if you get the word red, and then word, then you get fire truck, you will click word faster than if you just got the word inflation or something. Then you'll be measurably slower if you got a word that's completely unrelated. And this is one way to measure how closely associated 2 words are. How much of a priming effect do they have on this kind of word decision task? So this model was good at explaining why it is that words can prime each other in this way, because they're more tightly associated in the network. It also explains why it's helpful to make connections between different ideas, right? It makes it so there's more that's associated with it, which means there's more that can prime you to remember it. However, this model has been criticized as neurologically unrealistic. It seems unlikely that there would be a single neuron, or even one cluster of neurons, that's the fire truck node in a network. So the more commonly accepted model now is neural networks, where it's not as though there's one node for red and one node for orange and one node for fire truck, and they're associated. Rather, there is a network, but different concepts will be not nodes, but patterns of activation. So a particular pattern of activation will be the fire truck pattern of activation. A different pattern will be the red pattern of activation, and so on. So this keeps some of the insights of the associative networks, but it's more neurologically realistic, because it seems unlikely that there will be separate nodes for every concept that we have. Okay. So we've been talking about long-term memory and different ways to get things into long-term memory. The next part talks about how long-term memory breaks down, like what the different subcomponents are. I think it would have made more sense to have that earlier, but whatever, the book did it the way it did it. So here's how it breaks down. So long-term, you can subdivide this into two parts, and each of those further breaks down. So one is, actually I'll make this bigger. There's multiple things to call this. So one is explicit or declarative. Those are synonyms in this context. And the other is implicit or procedural. So I'll start with this distinction. Now each of these is going to further subdivide, but explicit memories are memories that, oh yes. Oh, okay, sorry. Go ahead. Absolutely can be related to other senses. So scheme, in fact, in many ways, it would often be more related to language. So a schema is any concept that you can easily put information into. So it's not like the method of loci, it's separate. I mean, there's a kind of connection, but yeah.
Schema, like, stronger, I guess, if it's related back to different senses. Like you said that smell is the strongest one when it comes to correlation with memory and stuff.
Yes, for evoking memories, yes.
So, like, a schema related to a certain smell would be stronger than a schema related to a visual schema.
That's a good question. I would be skeptical of that just because smell is less detailed. What smell is best at is triggering memories. So you smell something and then, oh, I have a memory now. But because we are not, our sense of smell is not very sensitive, we can't have really detailed representations in smell, whereas for vision, we can have very detailed representations. So I would bet that vision would be better for encoding a really complicated long-term memory. Smell is just better at triggering them, if that makes sense.
So, like, I guess, like, the reason I'm asking is because, okay, you know Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, so you see the picture of it and you can tell which one it is. And I'm relating it back to, like, my mom, she cooks, and so if you put certain spices and oil, she can smell it and she can tell you what you're making. So is that like a schema?
Oh, that's interesting. I'm going to say I don't know and don't worry about it, but I'm just not sure if smell is detailed enough to be a schema. I think it has to be something a bit more consciously articulable than that. But don't worry about that. That's just my guess based on what they would say, but it's an interesting question. Any other questions on schemas or something prior? Yeah.
So how would alphabets work? Because I'm not sure, like, alphabets don't have to be, like, in, like, the order that we have right now, but, like, what? So, like, why, like, how would, like, alphabets work and, like...
I mean, like, why were they made? I'm sure it's just random. I mean, there's... Yeah. I'm not sure I have much to say. I'm not an expert in the history of language. I suspect it was just historical accident. But, okay, so as I was saying, the difference between these two is explicit or declarative memories are memories that you can consciously access and consciously articulate. Right? Declarative, think like you can talk about them, right? You can declare them. Whereas implicit or procedural memories are memories that you cannot consciously articulate. So I'm going to give more examples later, but think about knowing how to ride a bike, which is definitely over here. It's often the case that you only have this kind of memory of that and not this kind. So here's an example. I was trying to teach my brother how to ride a bike, and I realized that I didn't know consciously. The hardest part for people who are learning is getting started, right? That initial, you have to, like, as I now know, put your foot on, kick a few times, and then start pedaling. And I could ride a bike easily, but I was explaining, okay, so when you start, because he was struggling, I'm like, no, Nathan, you've got to start, and I didn't know. So I had to actually get on, do it, and then go, wait, what the hell am I doing? And then tell him, right? Because I only had implicit memory of it. I didn't have memory that I could consciously articulate to my brother. So these further break down. So explicit breaks down into, I'll put it in the same word the book does, episodic and semantic. And implicit breaks down into learning skills, so riding a bike would be an example. And classical conditioning is technically also a kind of implicit memory, which we've already talked about before. Oh, I see that we are almost out of time. You know what? We'll stop there. We'll start with this next class. So I will see you all on Thursday.